At this point, every single retro video game console has that one or two games that make collectors salivate and also question the importance of needing to pay their bills. The NES has Little Samson, the TurboGrafx 16 has Magical Chase, and the Saturn, well, has like 50 games like this. If you've even considered collecting for the Sega Saturn over the past decade, you are fully aware of how insanely expensive it is to acquire some of its rare and most sought after games. However, there is one Japanese exclusive Saturn game that seemingly stands above all the rest as maybe the most valuable, most desirable, and most interesting out of all of them. That game is Shinrei Jusatsushi Taromaru, roughly translated as Psychic Assassin Taromaru or Psychic Killer Taromaru. You know what, we're just gonna call this game Taromaru, okay? Anyhow, Taromaru is an action side-scroller developed and published by Time Warner Interactive in 1997 and released exclusively in Japan for the Saturn. Unfortunately, Taromaru was Time Warner's very last game before they went belly up, and if you really want to get technical, Taromaru was actually released after Time Warner went out of business. Enter Taromaru's insane rarity and collectability. While the exact figure on how many copies of Taromaru made it to store shelves is technically unknown and heavily disputed, it's generally believed that fewer than 10,000 copies were ever printed. To give you some context, another very rare sought-after Saturn game, Panzer Dragoon Saga, has almost 3 times that many copies produced in North America alone. Yeah, when was the last time that you saw Panzer Dragoon Saga just hanging out on store shelves for months just waiting to be bought? That's what I thought. So yeah, this game is insanely rare, but that's only half the story. Pretty much the best way to describe Taromaru's gameplay, design, and influences would be if you combine Shinobi, Castlevania, Gunstar Heroes, and Wild Guns, and their baby would be this game. So yeah, you have all these beloved and highly acclaimed series represented in a single game, and on top of that, you're more likely to get struck by lightning than you are to find a copy of this game. This is the perfect recipe for an insanely sought-after collector's item that fetches hundreds if not thousands of dollars. While there is no doubt that Taromaru is collectible, rare, and awesome looking, the question remains whether this game is actually any fun to play. Unfortunately, there are way too many overhyped, overrated, and wildly mediocre hidden gems out there that are talked about in collecting circles like they're the greatest game you've never played. From my experience, these rare hidden gem games typically range from alright to kinda shitty 90% of the time. And look, I get it, no one wants to admit that that cool looking ultra rare game they've obsessed over for years is just okay. It's way more fun to fantasize and pretend a game is just as good as the best games on a given console, when in fact they aren't even half as good as their far more common counterparts. With that said, however, it's hard to imagine a game that looks and sounds like this being anything but incredible. I mean seriously, there are entries in the Castlevania series that look like bargain bin schlock compared to Taromaru. However, looks can be deceiving, and there are plenty of cool looking, beautiful games out there that are worse than a root canal when you actually play them. That's why I'm here to jump into Taromaru and find if it's worth all the hype, or if it's just another overhyped, overpriced video game collector's trophy that's little more than a shelf decoration you can brag about owning. As mentioned before, Taromaru is a side-scrolling action game very similar to Castlevania or Shinobi in terms of how it controls and plays. Not only that, but like those two franchises, Taromaru incorporates tons of supernatural and Japanese folklore elements as well. You'll be battling ninjas, monsters, priests, zombies, and samurais throughout the game. However, these run-of-the-mill enemies are all the tip of the iceberg. In straight-up treasure fashion, Taromaru is pretty much an hour-long boss rush. Essentially, you fight a section of basic bad guys before fighting a massive demon, then you get to go through a tricky platforming area with some other minor enemies to fight another awesome boss after that, get through another relatively unremarkable section, and minutes later you're up against Slippy Frog on steroids. This constantly keeps the gameplay of Taromaru interesting and fun, and the hour or so this game takes to beat will slip away quickly given the game's excellent pacing. That is if you can actually get through this game. In true 90s side-scrolling action game fashion, Taromaru is f***ing hard, like really f***ing hard. The game throws tons of enemies at you at various places throughout the game, and nearly all the aforementioned bosses are pretty damn hard as well. Even with the various abilities and weapons at your disposal, you'll be constantly be put to the test with this one, and will likely have to play through Taromaru many times before seeing the final boss and end credits roll. Unfortunately, some of Taromaru's difficulty has to do with the limitations of its gameplay. Okay, let's just yank the band-aid right off, shall we? The fact that you can't move and shoot at the same time is this game's ultimate flaw. You'll constantly have to decide whether it's more important to evade enemies and their attacks, or thin the herd and blast these assholes away, but don't you dare try and do both together. I have a hard time defending this gameplay decision since many games released during the mid to late 90s, and hell, even before that, give the player the ability to both attack and evade at the same time. The fact that Taromaru doesn't allow you to do this is frankly unacceptable and a huge demerit to its gameplay. While on the topic of disappointing gameplay decisions, the movement controls for each of the playable characters in Taromaru feel fairly stiff and rigid as well. While the game's main character Taromaru is a lot quicker and agile than the other playable character Enkai, it's still not great either way. Each character also has a slide ability as well, which is pretty useful for evading enemy attacks or needing to get to the other side of the screen in a pinch. And while Taromaru is definitely the more agile of the two playable characters, Enkai's attacks are more powerful and the range of his shot is also better. Speaking of attacking, this game utilizes a target reticle that locks onto enemies in front of you, where you can then either blast them away with your standard shot, or even possess a standard enemy to fight alongside you. Both of these attack abilities also can be charged up to deal out huge damage or possess a target faster. Aiming the reticle is done automatically, however using the shoulder buttons on the controller allow you to change which enemy you're targeting. Unfortunately, selecting the enemy you want to fire upon is done in a scrolling fashion, where the game will decide which enemy in front of you will get targeted next. While this might not sound like a problem, it can result in you taking a ton of damage as the reticle scrolls through 4 or 5 targets before landing on the one you actually want to attack. In other words, the targeting system is fairly inefficient and definitely contributes to Taromaru's difficulty, but for all the wrong reasons. Other than the two attack types, you also have a protective energy bubble you can use, which blocks enemy attacks for a brief second, but also prevents you from doing anything else while you're performing this ability. This ability can definitely come in handy and is actually required in order to avoid taking damage while fighting several of the bosses. But just like not being able to attack and move at the same time, it would be nice to be able to use this ability while moving and attacking as well, making the protective bubble yet another limitation of Taromaru's already limited gameplay. Everything considered, Taromaru's gameplay is, well, okay. It certainly isn't a dumpster fire or so broken and cumbersome that it ruins the game, but it definitely lacks many of the refinements and polish that many other action games released during the 90s possess. Still, when you finally get the hang of the game's controls and compensate for some of its shortcomings, Taromaru is actually a pretty fun game to play. You really just have to take the good with the bad with this one. However, one thing that is absolutely not bad, like not at all, is Taromaru's presentation. Taromaru is essentially Japanese culture and folklore porn. Taking place in feudal Japan overrun by demons, spirits, monsters, and ghosts, Taromaru is so Japanese it'll make your head explode. I absolutely love the art direction and design of literally everything offered in this game. Everything from battling demon monks on the roof of a pagoda to blasting a kaiju skeleton in the distance to freaking battling Ninetales from Pokemon makes me want to sip some green tea and watch tentacle hentai something fierce. In all seriousness though, I can think of very few games that are this saturated in Japanese folklore, mythology, and culture than Taromaru. Most of the enemies and bosses are 2D sprites, while most of the background and foreground elements are in 3D. There are actually some pretty cool 3D effects like the perspective changing when walking through a village, or as you battle a demon inside of a tunnel. I feel like anytime I talk about 3D anything from the 90s, I also have to throw out a disclaimer of yeah, these aren't the most polished graphics ever, but judging this game for the time it was released, these were actually pretty impressive graphics. However, the standouts are definitely the game's 2D elements. Perhaps the highlight of Taromaru is its many boss battles throughout. Each boss is unique, highly detailed, and just has that level of polish seen in very few other 2D action games of the 90s. Even your basic enemies are all pretty detailed and definitely fit in with the overall design and aesthetic of this game. My only gripe with these standard enemies are how they are recycled and reused far too much throughout Taromaru, but pretty much all other games were doing the same thing back then, so I can't be too critical of it. Taromaru also has a story too. I mean, of course it does. Why else would you be fighting hordes of demons and ninjas, right? From what I've gathered, Taromaru has a pretty simple, generic story. Pretty much Demon Overlord has unleashed hell on Earth and it's up to you to stop him. There's also some maiden that you have to save as well. So essentially Taromaru's story is Doom meets Super Mario Brothers. Pretty legit, I guess. It would be nice if there were more substance to the plot than this, but for what it is, I can definitely buy it, and honestly, it barely matters since destroying 10-story tall demons and dragons is just too damn fun. And last but certainly not least is Taromaru's soundtrack, which wow, just wow. Going along perfectly with the feudal Japan setting and Japanese folklore creatures, the music goes perfectly with all of this. As anyone who watched my Tail Concerto review, or should I say Tail Concerto review, can tell you, I'm not the best when it comes to musical terminology or really anything technical about music. So I'm not going to pretend I know what cool Japanese instruments are playing or what you'd classify this sort of music as, but whatever it is, it's perfect for this game and just sounds incredible. Taromaru also has some voice acting between cutscenes and various interactions between characters within the game. This is all fine and dandy despite my understanding of Japanese being fairly minimal and also the absence of any English subtitles. There's also various sound effects ranging from explosions to monster groans and screams. It all goes together well with the action taking place and definitely adds to the excellent presentation of this game. So with all that said, is Taromaru just another incredibly overpriced, overhyped collector's item? Based on the game's merits alone, yes, Taromaru is very, very overpriced and overhyped. There are way better side-scrolling action games released during the 90s and even on the Saturn that are significantly cheaper and more fun. However, that's not to say this game isn't really fun and highly enjoyable, because it absolutely is. Taromaru is definitely a very unique experience on all fronts, and if you were looking for something different, then this game would be hard to beat. But considering you're pretty much having to pick up a second job to afford this game, I can't recommend anyone actually go out and buy this game if they simply want to play and experience it. Even at a quarter of Taromaru's typical asking price, I'd still struggle to recommend purchasing it. But with Time Warner Interactive being long gone and the current rights holder of this game probably being completely unaware they even own it, I definitely recommend getting creative and finding a way to play this game that doesn't require applying for a loan. However, if you're rich and want to make a bunch of random collectors in a Facebook group or gaming forum seethe with jealousy, then there are few better ways to accomplish this than picking up a copy of this game. But whether you decide to emulate or purchase Taromaru, definitely check this one out for a pretty good example of 90s action side-scrolling awesomeness. That's all I have for you this time, folks. Thanks everyone for watching, liking, and subscribing, and I'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.